They call it the People's House, a shining white mansion, a symbol of freedom, democracy, and power. But behind its marble walls lies a story built not on liberty, but on bondage. Because the White House, the home of America's presidents, was built, in large part, by enslaved African Americans. It's hard to imagine now, the manicured lawns, the grand columns, the stately facade. But in 1792, the land where the White House now stands was nothing more than a muddy field surrounded by dense forest and the distant hum of the Potomac River. Workers began arriving that year, men with calloused hands, tools slung over their shoulders, sweat already shining in the humid Washington air. Among them were Irish immigrants, poor freemen, and enslaved men hired out by their masters. They came not by choice, but by command. Their owners had struck deals with federal officials, leasing out human lives for government profit. The government didn't own slaves itself, but it rented them. And with that, the foundations of the White House, America's symbol of freedom, were laid by people who were not free.
President George Washington had chosen the site himself. The new Capitol would rise on the banks of the Potomac, a grand vision of a republic's power. An Irish-born architect named James Hoban won the competition to design the presidential mansion. He imagined an elegant neoclassical palace, inspired by European ideals, but built on American soil. To make it real, he needed an army of workers. There weren't enough skilled free laborers in the young capital, so he turned to the labor force that built much of the early United States, enslaved African Americans. Between 1792 and 1800, enslaved men were hired out by their owners from Maryland, Virginia, and beyond. They were paid nothing. Their masters received the wages. In government payroll records, their names appear, sometimes only first names, sometimes none at all. One document from 1795 lists 4 men: Peter, Ben, Daniel, and Harry. Next to their names, a simple note: Negro carpenters hired from James Hoban. Nothing more. No ages, no origins, no lives. Just numbers in ink. Yet behind those names were skilled craftsmen, men who knew how to shape timber, carve stone, raise walls that would last for centuries. They were artisans, builders, fathers, sons, and their hands shaped the bones of a nation's house.
The story begins not in Washington, but about 40 miles away in Aquia Creek, Virginia. That's where the sandstone for the White House was quarried. Enslaved men were sent deep into the quarries, swinging hammers, breaking stone under the sun. Each block had to be cut by hand, chiseled, squared, loaded onto flatboats, and shipped up the Potomac River toward the Capitol. Those boats, too, were rowed and guided by enslaved labor. The journey was grueling: heavy stone, strong currents, summer storms. But it was cheaper than hiring free workers. And so the system continued. The federal project, the pride of a free republic, rested on the economics of human bondage. When the sandstone arrived, enslaved stonecutters and masons shaped it into smooth, pale blocks. They mixed lime and sand for mortar. They raised scaffolds and hammered joints into place. They worked from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, with Sunday their only rest. The tools were crude, the work dangerous. Falls from scaffolds were common. Cuts from stone and splinters festered. Lime burned their hands. Dust scarred their lungs. Still, the walls began to rise, row by row, block by block, until the mansion stood proud above the city, gleaming white in the afternoon light. The same white that would later symbolize purity and freedom was first the color of limestone dust clinging to the skin of enslaved builders.
Government ledgers listed payments, not to the workers, but to their owners. Sometimes owners were reimbursed directly. Other times they collected lump sums through contractors. No enslaved worker signed his own name on a government document. Their labor was counted, but their humanity was not. They lived in crude shelters near the site, wooden huts, tents, or rented-out buildings. They slept on straw, ate simple rations, and endured brutal Washington summers. They worked alongside Irish and Scottish immigrants, men also struggling for survival. Yet one group could go home at night, while the other could not. The enslaved were bound, body and soul, to the project. Their toil filled the silence beneath the marble halls. Despite their condition, many enslaved workers were highly skilled. They were carpenters, plasterers, sawyers, and stonecutters. They built moldings and mantels, cut precise joints, carved decorative trim. These were not untrained laborers. They were experts in the crafts of building. Historians have since traced connections between enslaved artisans in Washington and skilled black craftsmen in Virginia and Maryland. Many had been apprenticed since youth, trained to master trades that enriched their owners. And now, their mastery was being used to construct the greatest house in the nation. Their legacy stands not in their names, but in every column, every corner, every perfectly joined beam of the White House.
Imagine the sight at dusk in 1794. Torches flickering over scaffolding, the rhythmic thud of hammers fading into the dark. The city still half wild, full of insects, mud, and mosquitoes. In the workers' quarters, the enslaved men ate sparse meals, cornmeal, salted pork, maybe a few vegetables if they were lucky. They spoke quietly of home, of the wives, children, and loved ones left behind on plantations. Some may have prayed, some dreamed of freedom. Others simply endured, because survival was their only rebellion left. No one wrote their stories. No artist painted their faces. Their lives slipped into silence as the house they built grew louder in history. In 1814, British troops invaded Washington during the War of 1812. They set fire to the president's house. The mansion burned from roof to cellar. The elegant interiors collapsed. The city's symbol of pride was reduced to a blackened shell. But when Reconstruction began, enslaved workers were called again. They cleared the debris, rebuilt walls, and helped restore what had been lost. Once more, the nation's Freedom House was raised by unfree hands.
The irony didn't end with construction. Presidents themselves brought enslaved people into the White House. George Washington brought his household servants from Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson brought enslaved cooks, valets, and maids, people like Edmund, Ursula, and John Hemmings, whose names appear in letters and journals. Inside the same walls where the words "We the People" were celebrated, enslaved men and women cooked meals, polished silver, made beds, and served guests. They listened to talk of liberty while living in chains. The nation's greatest contradictions played out not in books, but in its kitchens and corridors. For decades, these stories lay buried in archives, faint lines in payrolls, forgotten vouchers in dusty boxes. But when historians began looking closely, they found clues. Receipts for wages paid to owners of Negro carpenters. Notes from the commissioners of public buildings. Correspondence from Hoban describing labor shortages. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. These weren't myths or exaggerations. They were facts, written in the ink of bureaucracy, hidden in plain sight. And yet, the workers themselves left no diaries, no letters. Their side of the story exists only in the weight of their labor.
For nearly 2 centuries, the story of the enslaved builders of the White House was erased from popular history. School books mentioned the architects, the presidents, the marble, but never the men who built it. When tourists came to Washington, guides told stories of democracy and leadership, not slavery and suffering. Even as monuments rose to celebrate freedom, the foundations beneath them were built on bondage. The silence wasn't accidental. It was chosen, part of a larger national amnesia designed to protect the myth of American innocence. Then, slowly, truth began to resurface. Historians, archivists, and descendants started asking questions. Who really built the White House? Where did the materials come from? Whose hands laid the stone? Institutions like the White House Historical Association and the National Archives began releasing documents and creating exhibits. Names like Peter, Ben, Daniel, and Harry returned to public memory. The National Museum of African American History and Culture devoted space to their story. Plaques were installed, educational programs were launched, and for the first time, the enslaved builders of the White House began to be seen not as shadows, but as human beings. In 2016, First Lady Michelle Obama stood before an audience and said something simple but powerful. "I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves." The line rippled across the nation. Some people doubted it, others dismissed it. But historians came forward with proof, payrolls, records, correspondence, undeniable evidence. It sparked a public reckoning. For some, it was uncomfortable. For others, it was vindicating, a truth finally spoken aloud from within the very house those men built. It reminded the country that acknowledging history isn't disrespecting the past, it's confronting it honestly. Today, genealogists and historians continue tracing the descendants of those who built the White House. Some have found ancestral links to families in Maryland and Virginia. Through oral histories and DNA studies, they piece together lost legacies, connecting living people to ancestors whose labor shaped the nation's capital. These descendants often speak of pride, but also pain. Pride that their ancestors' craftsmanship still stands, and pain that their names were almost lost forever. One descendant once said, "My great-great-grandfather helped build that house, but his name isn't carved anywhere on it. Only the building remembers him."
If you look closely at the White House today, at the limestone blocks, the carved moldings, the seams between stones, you see more than craftsmanship. You see endurance. You see lives pressed into permanence. Every line of chisel and curve of wood carries the echo of someone's breath, someone's strength, someone's story that history almost forgot. The White House isn't just a building, it's a witness.
I I am not very. If I like, I don't have any desire to produce. I'm like,
Today, visitors to Washington, D.C. walk through the gates of the White House and see a pristine facade, white, grand, and unblemished. But if you listen closely, beneath the echo of footsteps and the hum of politics, you can still hear something else. The rhythm of hammers, the scrape of chisels, the steady breathing of men who worked until their muscles burned and their hands bled. Their bodies are gone, their names almost lost, but their work remains, as solid, enduring, and unyielding as the stone they laid. To tell their story is to rewrite the meaning of the White House itself. It is no longer just a monument to power, it is a memorial to perseverance. A house that represents freedom, built by those denied it. A symbol of democracy, raised by those who had none. A testament to what America was and what it still strives to be. Every president who walks its halls, every visitor who tours its rooms stands upon the work of enslaved builders whose names the world must now remember. They were the invisible architects of liberty, and the house they built still stands. History often paints over its scars. The White House was whitewashed, literally and metaphorically, to hide the marks of fire, time, and human suffering. But the truth doesn't disappear. It lingers, waiting to be spoken aloud. When we say the White House was built by enslaved people, we aren't tearing down the symbol, we're finally setting it on a foundation of truth. Because the real story of the White House isn't just about presidents and politics. It's about the people whose sweat, skill, and silence built the heart of the American dream and the contradiction at its core.